The Adventure of the Speckled Band by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In glancing over my notes of the 70-odd cases in which I have during the last 8 years studied the methods of my friend Sherlock Holmes, I find many tragic, some comic, a large number merely strange, but none commonplace. For working as he did rather for the love of his art than for the acquirement of wealth, he refused to associate himself with any investigation which did not tend towards the unusual and even the fantastic. Of all these varied cases, however, I cannot recall any which presented more singular features than that which was associated with the well-known Surrey family of the Roylotts of Stoke Newington. The events in question occurred in the early days of my association with Holmes, when we were sharing rooms as bachelors in Baker Street. It is possible that I might have placed them upon record before, but a promise of secrecy was made at the time, from which I have only been freed during the last month by the untimely death of the lady to whom the pledge was given. It is perhaps as well that the facts should now come to light, for I have reasons to know that there are widespread rumours as to the death of Dr. Grimesby Roylott, which tend to make the matter even more terrible than the truth. It was early in April in the year 83 that I woke one morning to find Sherlock Holmes standing fully dressed by the side of my bed. He was a late riser, as a rule, and as the clock on the mantelpiece showed me that it was only 7:15, I blinked up at him in some surprise and perhaps just a little resentment, for I was myself regular in my habit. "Very sorry to knock you up, Watson," said he, "but it's the common lot this morning." "Mrs. Hudson has been knocked up," she retorted upon me, "and I on you." "What is it then? A fire?" "No, a client. It seems that a young lady has arrived in a considerable state of excitement who insists upon seeing me. She is waiting now in the sitting room." Now, when young ladies wander about the metropolis at this hour of the morning and knock sleepy people up out of their beds, I presume that it is something very pressing which they have to communicate. Should it prove to be an interesting case, you would, I am sure, wish to follow it from the outset. I thought, at any rate, that I should call you and give you the chance. My dear fellow, I would not miss it for anything. I had no keener pleasure than in following Holmes in his professional investigations, and in admiring the rapid deductions as swift as intuitions, and yet always founded on a logical basis, with which he unravelled the problems which were submitted to him. I rapidly threw on my clothes and was ready in a few minutes to accompany my friend down to the sitting room. A lady dressed in black and heavily veiled, who had been sitting in the window, rose as we entered. "Good morning, madam," said Holmes cheerily. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my intimate friend and associate, Dr. Watson, before whom you can speak as freely as before myself." "Ha! I am glad to see that Mrs. Hudson has had the good sense to light the fire. Pray draw up to it, and I shall order you a cup of hot coffee, for I observe that you are shivering."
"It is not cold which makes me shiver,"
said the woman in a low voice, changing her seat as requested. "What then?"
"It is fear, Mr. Holmes. It is terror."
She raised her veil as she spoke, and we could see that she was indeed in a pitiable state of agitation, her face all drawn and grey, with restless, frightened eyes like those of some hunted animal. Her features and figure were those of a woman of 30, but her hair was shot with premature grey, and her expression was weary and haggard. Sherlock Holmes ran her over with one of his quick, all-comprehensive glances. "You must not fear," said he soothingly, bending forward and patting her forearm. "We shall soon set matters right, I have no doubt. You have come in by train this morning, I see."
"You know me then?"
"No, but I observed the second half of a return ticket in the palm of your left glove. You must have started early, and yet you had a good drive in a dog cart along heavy roads before you reached the station." The lady gave a violent start and stared in bewilderment at my companion. "There is no mystery, my dear madam," said he, smiling. "The left arm of your jacket is spattered with mud in no less than 7 places. The marks are perfectly fresh. There is no vehicle save a dog cart which throws up mud in that way, and then only when you sit on the left-hand side of the driver."
"Whatever your reasons may be, you are perfectly correct. I started from home before 6, reached Leatherhead at 20 past, and came in by the first train to Waterloo. Sir, I can stand this strain no longer. I shall go mad if it continues. I have no one to turn to. None, save only one who cares for me, and he, poor fellow, can be of little aid. I have heard of you, Mr. Holmes. I have heard of you from Mrs. Farintosh, whom you helped in the hour of her sore need. It was from her that I had your address. Oh, sir, do you not think that you could help me too, and at least throw a little light through the dense darkness which surrounds me? At present it is out of my power to reward you for your services, but in a month or 6 weeks I shall be married, with the control of my own income, and then at least you shall not find me ungrateful.
Holmes turned to his desk and, unlocking it, drew out a small casebook, which he consulted. Farintosh, said he. Ah, yes, I recall the case. It was concerned with an opal tiara. I think it was before your time, Watson. I can only say, madam, that I shall be happy to devote the same care to your case as I did to that of your friend. As to reward, my profession is its own reward. But you are at liberty to defray whatever expenses I may be put to at the time which suits you best. And now I beg that you will lay before us everything that may help us in forming an opinion upon the matter.
Alas, the very horror of my situation lies in the fact that my fears are so vague, and my suspicions depend so entirely upon small points, which might seem trivial to another, that even he to whom of all others I have a right to look for help and advice looks upon all that I tell him about it as the fancies of a nervous woman. He does not say so, but I can read it from his soothing answers and averted eyes. But I have heard, Mr. Holmes, that you can see deeply into the manifold wickedness of the human heart. You may advise me how to walk amid the dangers which encompass me.
I am all attention, madam.
My name is Helen Stoner, and I am living with my stepfather, who is the last survivor of one of the oldest Saxon families in England, the Roylotts of Stoke Moran, on the western border of Surrey.
Holmes nodded his head. The name is familiar to me, said he.
The family was at one time among the richest in England, and the estates extended over the borders into Berkshire in the north and Hampshire in the west. In the last century, however, 4 successive heirs were of a dissolute and wasteful disposition, and the family ruin was eventually completed by a gambler in the days of the Regency. Nothing was left save a few acres of ground, and the 200-year-old house, which is itself crushed under a heavy mortgage. The last squire dragged out his existence there, living the horrible life of an aristocratic pauper, but his only son, my stepfather, seeing that he must adapt himself to the new conditions, obtained an advance from a relative, which enabled him to take a medical degree, and went out to Calcutta, where, by his professional skill and his force of character, he established a large practice. In a fit of anger, however, caused by some robberies which had been perpetrated in the house, he beat his native butler to death and narrowly escaped a capital sentence. As it was, he suffered a long term of imprisonment and afterwards returned to England a morose and disappointed man. When Dr. Roylott was in India, he married my mother, Mrs. Stoner, the young widow of Major General Stoner of the Bengal Artillery. My sister Julia and I were twins, and we were only 2 years old at the time of my mother's remarriage. She had a considerable sum of money, not less than £1,000 a year, and this she bequeathed to Dr. Roylott entirely while we resided with him, with a provision that a certain annual sum should be allowed to each of us in the event of our marriage. Shortly after our return to England, my mother died. She was killed 8 years ago in a railway accident near Crewe. Dr. Roylott then abandoned his attempts to establish himself in practice in London and took us to live with him in the old ancestral house at Stoke Moran. The money which my mother had left was enough for all our wants, and there seemed to be no obstacle to our happiness. But a terrible change came over our stepfather about this time. Instead of making friends and exchanging visits with our neighbors, who had at first been overjoyed to see a Roylott of Stoke Moran back in the old family seat, he shut himself up in his house and seldom came out, save to indulge in ferocious quarrels with whoever might cross his path. Violence of temper approaching to mania has been hereditary in the men of the family, and in my stepfather's case, it had, I believe, been intensified by his long residence in the tropics. A series of disgraceful brawls took place, 2 of which ended in the police court, until at last he became the terror of the village, and the folks would fly at his approach, for he is a man of immense strength, and absolutely uncontrollable in his anger. Last week, he hurled the local blacksmith over a parapet into a stream, and it was only by paying over all the money which I could gather together that I was able to avert another public exposure. He had no friends at all save the wandering gypsies, and he would give these vagabonds leave to encamp upon the few acres of bramble-covered land which represent the family estate, and would accept in return the hospitality of their tents, wandering away with them sometimes for weeks on end. He has a passion also for Indian animals, which are sent over to him by a correspondent, and he has at this moment a cheetah and a baboon, which wander freely over his grounds and are feared by the villagers almost as much as their master. You can imagine from what I say that my poor sister Julia and I had no great pleasure in our lives. No servant would stay with us, and for a long time we did all the work of the house. She was but 30 at the time of her death, and yet her hair had already begun to whiten, even as mine has.
Your sister is dead, then?
She died just 2 years ago, and it is of her death that I wish to speak to you. You can understand that, living the life which I have described, we were little likely to see anyone of our own age and position. We had, however, an aunt, my mother's maiden sister, Miss Honoria Westphale, who lives near Harrow, and we were occasionally allowed to pay short visits at this lady's house. Julia went there at Christmas 2 years ago, and met there a half-pay major of Marines, to whom she became engaged. My stepfather learned of the engagement when my sister returned, and offered no objection to the marriage. But within a fortnight of the day which had been fixed for the wedding, the terrible event occurred which has deprived me of my only companion.
Sherlock Holmes had been leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed and his head sunk in a cushion, but he half opened his lids now and glanced across at his visitor. "Pray be precise as to details," said he.
It is easy for me to be so, for every event of that dreadful time is seared into my memory. The manor house is, as I have already said, very old, and only one wing is now inhabited. The bedrooms in this wing are on the ground floor, the sitting rooms being in the central block of the buildings. Of these bedrooms, the first is Dr. Roylott's, the second my sister's, and the third my own. There is no communication between them, but they all open out into the same corridor. Do I make myself plain?
Perfectly so.
The windows of the 3 rooms open out upon the lawn. That fatal night, Dr. Roylott had gone to his room early, though we knew that he had not retired to rest, for my sister was troubled by the smell of the strong Indian cigars which it was his custom to smoke. She left her room, therefore, and came into mine, where she sat for some time, chatting about her approaching wedding. At 11 o'clock she rose to leave me, but she paused at the door and looked back.
Tell me, Helen, have you ever heard anyone whistle in the dead of the night?
Never.
I suppose that you could not possibly whistle yourself in your sleep?
Certainly not, but why?
Because during the last few nights I have always about 3 in the morning heard a low, clear whistle. I am a light sleeper, and it has awakened me. I cannot tell where it came from, perhaps from the next room, perhaps from the lawn. I thought that I would just ask you whether you had heard it.
No, I have not.
It must be those wretched gypsies in the plantation.
Very likely.
And yet if it were on the lawn, I wonder that you did not hear it also.
Ah, but I sleep more heavily than you.
Well, it is of no great consequence at any rate.
She smiled back at me, closed my door, and a few moments later I heard her key turn in the lock.
"Indeed," said Holmes. "Was it your custom always to lock yourselves in at night?"
Always. And why? I think that I mentioned to you that the doctor kept a cheetah and a baboon. We had no feeling of security unless our doors were locked.
Quite so. Pray proceed with your statement.
I could not sleep that night. A vague feeling of impending misfortune impressed me. My sister and I, you will recollect, were twins, and you know how subtle are the links which bind 2 souls which are so closely allied. It was a wild night. The wind was howling outside, and the rain was beating and splashing against the windows. Suddenly, amid all the hubbub of the gale, there burst forth the wild scream of a terrified woman. I knew that it was my sister's voice. I sprang from my bed, wrapped a shawl round me, and rushed into the corridor. As I opened my door, I seemed to hear a low whistle, such as my sister described, and a few moments later a clanging sound, as if a mass of metal had fallen. As I ran down the passage, my sister's door was unlocked and revolved slowly upon its hinges. I stared at it in horror. Freshly awakened as I was, my mind was still half bemused with sleep, and I can only vaguely remember the vague terror which seized me as I looked at that gaping doorway and saw that figure slowly swaying from side to side, her face blanched with terror, her hand pressed over her heart as though to keep down some rising sense of panic. Her face was white as a sheet, and her eyes were staring horribly out of her head. As I approached her, she suddenly staggered and fell to the ground. She writhed as one who is in terrible pain, and her limbs were dreadfully convulsed. At first I thought that she had not recognized me, but as I bent over her, she suddenly shrieked out in a voice which I shall never forget.
"Oh my God! Helen! It was the band! The speckled band!"
There was something else which she would fain have said, and she stabbed with her finger into the air in the direction of the doctor's room, but a fresh convulsion seized her and choked her words. I rushed out, calling loudly for my stepfather, and I met him hastening from his room in his dressing gown. When he reached my sister's side, she was unconscious, and though he poured brandy down her throat and sent for medical aid from the village, all efforts were in vain, for she slowly sank and died without having recovered her consciousness. Such was the dreadful end of my beloved sister.
"One moment," said Holmes. "Are you sure about this whistle and metallic sound? Could you swear to it?"
That was what the county coroner asked me at the inquiry. It is my strong impression that I heard it, and yet among the crash of the gale and the creaking of an old house, I may possibly have been deceived.
Was your sister dressed?
No, she was in her nightdress. In her right hand was found the charred stump of a match, and in her left a matchbox, showing that she had struck a light and looked about her when the alarm took place. That is important.
And what conclusions did the coroner come to?
He investigated the case with great care, for Dr. Roylott's conduct had long been notorious in the county, but he was unable to find any satisfactory cause of death. My evidence showed that the door had been fastened upon the inner side, and the windows were blocked by old-fashioned shutters with broad iron bars, which were secured every night. The walls were carefully sounded, and were shown to be quite solid all round, and the flooring was also thoroughly examined, with the same result. The chimney is wide, but is barred up by 4 large staples. It is certain, therefore, that my sister was quite alone when she met her end. Besides, there were no marks of any violence upon her.
How about poison?
The doctors examined her for it, but without success.
What do you think that this unfortunate lady died of, then?
It is my belief that she died of pure fear and nervous shock, though what it was that frightened her I cannot imagine.
Was there any insanity in your family?
As far as I know, none.
Would you mind telling me what your own impressions are upon the matter?
My fear was of some danger which might come to me through my stepfather. I have heard that, before my sister's death, Dr. Roylott was in the habit of locking his door each night and keeping a loaded revolver in his room, and that he had shouted at the housemaids when they had tried to touch anything in his room. I was certain that he would attempt something violent, so I kept my door locked every night and slept with a revolver in my hand. But although I have done this, I have never had any grounds to suspect Dr. Roylott of actual violence toward me.
Holmes shook his head like a man who is far from satisfied. You are undoubtedly in danger, Miss Stoner, and you must act at once to protect yourself.
What should I do?
You must sleep tonight in your own room as usual, but you must promise me not to lock your door. We will await you outside in the meadow where no one can hear or disturb us. After everyone has gone to bed, we will come into your room and investigate matters for ourselves. But what about my stepfather?
He must believe
that you are still locked in your room and in no danger. Do you have the key to your own room?
Yes, Mr. Holmes.
Then lock the door from the outside with the key and pretend to go to bed. We will enter later on.
Very well, Mr. Holmes. I trust your judgment.
Miss Stoner rose to her feet and thanked Sherlock Holmes before leaving the room. When our visitor had left us, Holmes sat for some time in silence, with his head sunk forward and his eyes bent upon the red glow of the fire. Then he lit his pipe and leaned back in his chair, with the cloud of smoke curling up from him and a look of infinite languor in his face. "Quite an interesting study, that woman," he observed. "She married her stepfather, made his acquaintances in India, and brought him home with her to England. Clearly, she was no fool and had some clear insight into Dr. Roylott's character. And yet, her own life and that of her sister were allowed to continue under the same roof as a man of such tendencies. That, Watson, is the curious part of it." "You have formed a theory, then?" "Yes, a provisional one, but I shall test it in the very first case of its application. Meanwhile, this inquiry seems to be pressing. Let us step out now, Watson, and follow this strange trail of the speckled band." After the client left, Holmes quickly packed a few essentials for the journey, and soon we found ourselves seated in a cab bound for Waterloo Station. It was a foggy afternoon, and the lamps were just being lit as we pushed through the crowded streets. Holmes was sunk in deep thought and hardly opened his mouth during the long drive. I followed his example and reserved my questions for a later time. At Waterloo, we caught the train to Leatherhead, and a short journey brought us to the little Surrey village. As we passed through the station, Holmes bought a bottle of claret, a piece of bread, and some cold beef, and we carried them with us in case our expedition should be a long one. The night was cold and clear as we left the train and struck across the wide open country which separates the village from the Roylott estate. It was a long and tiring walk, but Holmes strode along with his long, nervous steps, as fresh as when we had started. "We must tread lightly here, Watson," he whispered when we finally reached the grounds of Stoke Moran. "The house is but a few hundred yards away, and we do not wish to attract attention. This clump of trees will serve as a hiding place while we survey the scene." We crouched among the bushes, peering through the branches at the dark outline of the old house. A single dim light glowed from one of the windows, but otherwise all seemed silent and deserted. "That is Miss Stoner's window, no doubt," whispered Holmes. "The shutters are up, but we can see the light of a lamp shining through the chinks. If I am not mistaken, the room which adjoins it on the left is the one which the lady occupied, and the centre one her sister's. We shall see whether my calculations are correct when we have a look inside." We stole across to the lawn, and as we reached it, a moment later, the door of the house opened and Dr. Grimesby Roylott strode out. He was a huge man. His face seamed with every evil passion, and his large yellow fangs were displayed in a grin. He was clad in a dressing gown and carried a hunting crop, swinging it back and forth as he walked. We crouched among the bushes, unseen, as he paced angrily up and down, muttering to himself. After a few minutes, he returned to the house, slamming the door behind him. Holmes nudged me, and we crept toward the windows of Miss Stoner's room. The shutters were fastened, but Holmes quickly produced a small knife and slipped it through a crack, forcing the catch open. We climbed inside noiselessly, where Helen Stoner was waiting for us.
"Have you brought the lamp?"
she whispered anxiously. "Yes," replied Holmes, producing a dark lantern. "Now, Miss Stoner, you must do exactly as I tell you. We shall stay in this room until everything is still in the house. Then we shall investigate your sister's room. Do not be afraid, for we shall not leave you until we have solved the mystery." Miss Stoner nodded and sat down on her bed, while Holmes and I took our places on either side of the fireplace, where we could watch both the window and the door. For what seemed like hours, we sat there in the silence, broken only by the occasional creak of a floorboard or the distant cry of a night bird. The tension was almost unbearable. Suddenly, Holmes sprang to his feet. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he whispered urgently. I listened intently, and there it was, the low, unmistakable whistle that Miss Stoner had described. Holmes's face was set in grim determination as he pointed to the wall. "Quick, Watson, into her sister's room. The game is afoot." We rushed silently into the adjoining room, Holmes holding up the dark lantern to guide us. The room was pitch dark, but Holmes swiftly placed the lantern on the bed and turned the light onto the bell pull hanging beside it. He examined it closely, tugging at it, and I could see it was fastened to a hook just above the ventilator. "Look, Watson," he whispered. "The bell rope is a dummy. It's not connected to anything." Holmes then directed the light toward the ventilator, a small opening in the wall, about 6 inches square, which connected this room with Dr. Roylott's. "It all fits together, Watson," he murmured. "This ventilator leads directly into Dr. Roylott's room. No wonder Miss Stoner heard a whistle. It came from here. And the bed is fastened to the floor, preventing the occupant from moving it away from the ventilator. Now we wait." We extinguished the lantern and waited in the pitch darkness, holding our breath, the silence heavy around us. Not a sound came from the room next door. Suddenly, from the direction of the ventilator, we heard a very faint hiss, like the noise of steam escaping from a kettle. Holmes leaped to his feet, and with a single bound, he struck a match and lashed furiously at the bell pull with his cane. "Do you see it, Watson? Do you see it?" he yelled. But I saw nothing. Only that Holmes's face had grown deathly pale, and his eyes blazed with a ferocity I had never seen before. I was about to ask what had happened when a horrible cry, the most terrible I had ever heard, rang out from Dr. Roylott's room. It was a scream of utter terror, mingled with the voice of a man in his death throes. Holmes dashed into the doctor's room, with me close at his heels. The sight which met our eyes froze the blood in our veins. Dr. Roylott sat in a chair beside his bed, his body contorted and his eyes staring up at the ceiling in a glassy expression of horror. Around his forehead was a peculiar band, spotted with brown and yellow. It was a snake, the deadliest snake in India, the swamp adder, whose bite is certain death. "The speckled band," whispered Holmes. He used the doctor's fire tongues to catch the snake and threw it into the iron safe where Dr. Roylott had kept it hidden. Then he slammed the door shut, locking the creature inside. "It is a swamp adder," cried Holmes, "the deadliest snake in India. He died within 10 seconds of being bitten. Violence does, in truth, recoil upon the violent, and the schemer falls into the pit which he digs for another. Let us thrust this creature back into its den, and we can then arrange for the police to carry away the doctor's body." As he spoke, he drew the steel poker from the fire, and with a single motion, thrust it into the snake's hole, twisting it round and round until the reptile writhed itself into a knot and fell limp. Holmes turned away from the grisly sight and beckoned me toward the corridor. "And now, Watson, let us examine the root of this evil. It should come as no surprise, Watson, that Dr. Roylott was behind this terrible scheme. He had trained the snake to slither through the ventilator and down the bell rope, a snake that he called back with a whistle after it had done its deadly work. He meant for it to kill Miss Stoner, just as it had killed her sister," I said. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "It is clear that Roylott's main motive was financial. If either of his stepdaughters married, part of their mother's estate would pass to them. By preventing their marriages through these fatal attacks, Roylott ensured that he retained control of the money. When Miss Stoner consulted us, I had little doubt that we were dealing with a deliberate murder, disguised as an unexplained death." I stared at Holmes in amazement. "And yet you had no real proof until tonight?" "Not until I heard the whistle and saw the snake. That is why I took the precaution of bringing my cane. The moment the snake was summoned through the ventilator, I attacked it, forcing it to turn upon its master. It was Roylott's own wickedness that caused his end." "And Miss Stoner is safe now?" "Entirely so," said Holmes. "Our work is done here, Watson. Let us leave these dark events behind us and return to Baker Street. Tomorrow morning, we can send for the local authorities to deal with the aftermath." We left Stoke Moran and made our way back to London in silence. It was not until we were back in the warmth of our Baker Street sitting room, with the light of dawn creeping in through the curtains, that Holmes spoke again. "I am no doubt indirectly responsible for Dr. Grimesby Roylott's death," he said, "but I cannot say that it is a matter which weighs very heavily upon my conscience."
As we left the crumbling walls of Stoke Moran behind, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange and terrible events we had witnessed. It was a reminder that even in the quiet English countryside, dark and deadly secrets could lie hidden. Yet, in the face of such evil, Holmes's brilliant mind had once again prevailed, bringing justice and safety to those in need. It was a case I would not soon forget, for it proved that sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones we cannot see until it is too late.